Hello and welcome to On the Line with Isaac Peltz. Today we have Yves Engler, a well-known activist, part of the Socialist Caucus of the NDP. I want to do a little introduction for Yves, but he's well known for his activism for the past 25 years, since the 2000s when he started doing his work in Concordia. He will be presenting himself as the potential next leader of the NDP. Yves was born in 1979. He's an author, activist, and he is known for his outspoken critiques of Canadian foreign policy. He was born in Vancouver to two parents who were part of labor unions, which inspired his progressive views and his participation as an activist. It shaped his consciousness, and Engler moved to Montreal in the 2000s to attend Concordia University, where he quickly became involved in student activism. He was elected vice president of communications for the Concordia Student Union, a role that placed him in the center of his new political life. Yves, how are you doing today? Welcome to the show. I really want to dive right into it and hear about your life.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a father of a 3-year-old and an 8-year-old, and I've been active on the left for, I guess, 25 years now, or maybe a bit longer even. And as you mentioned, I grew up in a family where my mother was active vice president of the BC Nurses Union. My father became a vice president of he worked at the Vancouver Sun, was vice president of union there for journalists, and was active for many decades in his union. And likewise with other family members, aunts, uncles. Both my uncles were elected presidents of the Longshore Union. They worked on tugboats, and they were presidents of their local at different periods of time. So I've been personally heavily involved, and familially been involved in sort of left-wing circles for pretty much my whole life.
Yves, I wanted to know, how did your parents kind of push you towards this? Did they actively tell you that this is the right thing to do, or were you simply inspired by the kind of work that they were doing?
Yeah, I grew up, like, my focus for most of my first 19 years of life was playing hockey. I played high level hockey. I played junior A hockey, and I had aspirations to go all the way to the NHL and stuff. But I was around left wing kind of conversation throughout that time, even if it wasn't necessarily the top of mind. I grew up in East Vancouver, which has obviously been an NDP stronghold for since before the NDP existed, so yeah, not really in a formal sense. No, I would say it's mostly that they laid the sort of values kind of orientation, and they discussed political affairs, but there was never any moment or where it's like, you have to do this, or you should do this, or I just kind of went off after finishing hockey at 19. I went off and I did a bit of traveling, and then I went to college. I was never good at school growing up, and I went to college in Vancouver for a bit, and then I had some good friends that were going to Montreal and going to McGill, and I was certainly not in a position to get into McGill. And so I went to Concordia, and I was lucky enough to kind of fall into a situation. I already was getting active in Vancouver with the anti-corporate globalization movement, but Concordia was really the hotbed. At that point, it had a couple of years of the most radical student union in the country, and I just kind of got thrown into the mix, if you like, and then lots of stuff happened from there.
Their first big moment, as far as I understand, ironically, or maybe not ironically, about the speech of Benjamin Netanyahu coming to speak in Montreal, right? Or was it at Concordia University?
It was at Concordia, and I was ultimately expelled from the university in the aftermath of the 2002 Netanyahu protests. And he was, of course, the prime minister in Israel in the mid-late 90s. At that point, 2002, he was no longer prime minister. And at that point, Concordia was really that's where Solidarity for Palestine Human Rights, SPHR, which then appeared on, 15 or some campuses across the country in subsequent years. It all comes out of the activism taking place at Concordia at that time. And so the pro-Israel, the pro-Zionist forces were basically trying to have Netanyahu speak. It was actually the Asper Foundation. Izzy Asper, the founder of Can West, which later becomes Post Media. They bring in the National Post and but they wanted to, as they put it, have Netanyahu in the viper's nest. That's what they referred to Concordia, the pro-Palestinian activism at Concordia as the viper's nest. Interesting enough, for me, Palestine wasn't really on my radar politically. What I was kind of tied into before I moved to Concordia, and even the first bits in Montreal, was the anti-corporate globalization movement, the WTO protests in Seattle in 99, then the Free Trade Area of the Americas protests in Quebec City in April 2001. When I went to Concordia, I was kind of mobilizing for that in my I guess that's the first year. And it was actually very big protests, of course, in Quebec City. And the Palestine issue was, I remember actually really clearly when I was my first couple of days at campus, I was given this booklet about Palestine. And I remember very clearly going to this pizza shop block away from the campus. And this was kind of my introduction to Palestine and the injustices, of course, taking place that Israel's committing against Palestinians. And I've told this story lots of times because it's indication of that random activist standing at the top of the stairs at the mezzanine of the Concordia Hall building, just handing out leaflets, and you just don't know what the impact's going to be. That person that doesn't know that actually had quite transformational impact on me politically.
That's crazy, dude.
But it's a sign of how that grassroots activism can have lots of success.
I want to talk about Haiti. So your first big focus in your activism career was Haiti and Canada's complicity in the coup d'etat of 2004. So could you talk a little bit about that? How did you get involved with that? And how did you start working to bring awareness to that situation?
Yeah, the 2004 coup is I would say, my introduction to, let's call it challenging Canadian imperialism. I was involved, obviously, but in the Concordia Student Union. We were involved in the Free Trade Area of the Americas. We were involved in Palestine protest of Netanyahu. I was involved in the opposition to the 2003 war in Iraq. We set up a group called Block the Empire. But I kind of had this notion of Canada as a peacekeeping nation. 2003 Iraq, officially we didn't join the Bush administration's coalition, the Willing. So I was politicized. I was clearly on the left and on the radical left. But I still had this notion of benevolent Canada. And in my first semester at Concordia, I took a history of Haiti course. And I did that in part because my uncle, when I went traveling for a couple months, backpacking around in Mexico, he gave me a copy of The Black Jacobins, which is about the Haitian Revolution and Toussaint Louverture. And it was written by a prominent Caribbean Marxist in the 1950s. So I had this sort of introduction to Haiti, and then I sort of saw in the lead up to February 29, 2004, and the months before, I saw that there was stuff happening. There was sort of destabilization. And I saw that Canada was involved. And in fact, Canadian special forces were at the Toussaint Louverture airport in Port-au-Prince when U.S. Marines in the middle of the night forced the elected president onto a plane and then ultimately dumped him in the Central African Republic. So Canada invaded Haiti to overthrow the elected government, and not just the elected president, but thousands of elected officials were pushed out. And then 500 plus Canadian troops were on the ground occupying Haiti. Paul Martin made the first ever trip by a Canadian prime minister to Haiti. Canada was training this police force that was killing people for opposing the coup. So Canada's hands were all over this coup, and it was a bloody coup. Thousands of people were killed as a result. Haiti hasn't recovered, and there's direct
20 years later, and then the earthquakes in
2010. Yeah,
2010. So between that and then the earthquakes, Haiti is still in a worse situation than ever.
Yes, and now today its situation has really descended into almost kind of state collapse.
Yeah.
So Canada's role in the coup really. That's what it took me aback, how involved Canada was, how undemocratic, how racist, how imperialistic Canada was. And so that actually then, so I was involved for 2+ years of spending almost all my time in Haiti Action Montreal and the Canada Haiti Action Network, and campaigning against Canada's role in the coup. And then there was a shift to slightly Rene Préval's election, the killing subsided and the shift. And I co-authored a short book called Canada and Haiti Waging War on the Poor Majority. And I basically decided that, well, if Canada had been so bad in Haiti, what had it done elsewhere historically? And that began a whole kind of research process where I ultimately published the Black Book
of Canadian Foreign Policy. Yeah.
Yeah. And while I was researching that, I realized there was so much about Canada's support for Zionism that I began kind of concurrent with that, ultimately published the Canada and Israel Building Apartheid. And then that just kind of opened up a whole series of the subject area of Canadian foreign policy that I looked at. And there's a Harper book, there's a book about Pearson, there's a book about Canada's role in Africa, with the same part of the same point, which is this business of a benevolent Canada is just absurd. It's absolutely not based in fact when you look at Canada's role at all kinds of places, but also in terms of understanding the why questions, right? Like this propaganda system. I published a 2016 book on the propaganda system in foreign policy, and then look at the left's role, left institutions' role in supporting Canadian imperialism and justifying a lot of these policies. So that basically began a whole kind of process, and then led to all kinds of things. The founding of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute 5 or 6 years ago, different activism in all kinds of different domains, and weirdly, it's also kind of led to this NDP leadership bid.
Before we get to that, I wanted to ask your last book, Canada's Long Fight Against Democracy. How has the reception gone? Are you happy with how it's been rolling out? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a book co-authored with Owen Schock, and it's basically looks at Canada's role in more than 20 overthrows of elected, mostly social democratic or socialist oriented leaders. And it obviously completely undercuts the notion that Canada's trying to advance democracy around the world, and we show how they have repeatedly undercut. And a lot of those examples that we go for, this goes from Arbenz or Mossadegh in Iran in the 90s all the way up until recently in Peru. And a lot of these examples, you would call them, about half of them are sort of like passive Canadian assistance. They're usually US-led coups. But then there's a whole bunch of the examples, the most egregious one being Haiti in 2004, where Canada, it's involved in every phase, the destabilization, NGOs, government Canadian aid money is used as a tool to destabilize and to undermine a government, military, policing apparatus, global affairs or diplomatic apparatus, that all elements of Canadian state foreign policy are involved in crushing democracy in the case of Haiti, in the most impoverished nation of this hemisphere. So yeah, the book, we did a tour. I don't remember exactly how many events we did, but we did 15, 20 events across the country. The dominant media, it's just they don't touch this stuff anymore.
They ignore you because you're on the left.
Yeah, they ignore me on the left. Earlier on, in an earlier time, there was a bit more space to get into the dominant media. It was an interesting one that got the Montreal Gazette to review the Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy because it got shortlisted for the English language fiction or nonfiction award here in Quebec.
Amazing.
They then doing obviously a hit job review, but it's better to get some attention than no attention in the corporate media. But so there's it's the people who read it and had positive comments, but it didn't obviously break into a wide audience.
So I want to dive right in then to the NDP leadership race. Why have you decided that you're going to put your hat forward?
Well, I was asked by the Socialist Caucus, specifically Barry, who brought it up to me. It was not on my radar whatsoever. This is about 2.5 months ago, I guess now. And I initially said that I have two young kids. I work a lot with different writing and activism. I got more than enough on my plate, and so I sort of said no, but I'll confirm a no later on. I didn't actually follow up with the confirmed no. He followed up pressed me again. I said, well, let me think about it for a few more days. And then I eventually came around to the idea. The reason politically is that there's the Holocaust in Gaza and Canada's complicity in the Holocaust. That's something I've been working on a lot the past 20 plus months. And I want to put more profile on that and push back on that, more. And the NDP leadership race offers some greater platform for that. But the reality is on Palestine, on Gaza specifically, the NDP's actually gotten a lot better with all the grassroots protests. They've been sort of pushed. They're still too soft in a whole bunch of areas and not expansive enough in their critique of Canada's complicity. But they are, raising the issue and pressing the matter. The other issue that really has come onto the agenda in a very clear way over the past few months, and is what kind of pushed me to take this up, is the radical militarist turn from Mark Carney. And this is huge increase in military spending right away. And this year they're trying to figure out how to get $9 billion spent by April, added $9 billion. They've already been increasing military spending each year, but then he added $9 billion more a couple months ago, just before the NATO convention, and they want to get that out the door by April. Now, just to give you perspective on that, the national school lunch program for all the schools in the country has been estimated at $2.7 billion per year. So we're talking about 3+ years of feeding all our children at schools for lunch program versus putting that into the military. So that issue, I believe, and it has, we've seen this play out in the last couple of months. It's increasingly, the military spending is coming at the expense of social programs and the social and the public service. So Carney has agreed to go up to this 5% of military spending, the GDP target that Donald Trump pushed NATO to agree to. And so this is going to lead to ever more reductions in social entitlements and social programs at the expense of the war machine. And the reality is the NDP has been complicit, if you like, in this militarist turn. They are not pushing back against foreign policy that it used to justify it, from this Russia to China to Iran. The NDP has gone along with the sort of U.S. empire's view of global affairs. Also, Heather McPherson, the lead candidate in the NDP leadership race, she's on the NATO Parliamentary Associations. She's a member of it. And she lauds the Canadian military. So she's not in a position to really push back against military spending. And what I'm seeing here is this military spending is very clearly in opposition to human welfare and funding human welfare of Canadians. And the best case scenario here with the military spending increase is that it's just a poor use of public resources diverting from social programs to the military. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that it also gives these monsters who've been enabling Israel's Holocaust in Gaza, it gives them, people like Mark Carney, Pierre Poilievre, it gives them a greater means to wage violence internationally. To intimidate countries internationally. That's what the Canadian military is about. It's not about defense. It's about assisting the U.S. empire's global domination. And I think particularly well placed on the Palestine issue. I know that Canada's complicity. I've stood up to Israel lobby, but also on the military issue, where my previous book, second to last book, is Stand On Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military. I know the institution. I know its history, and so I'm in a better place to articulate a human welfare, not warfare kind of perspective. And so that's really what kind of prompted me to accept. And I have to say, over the past 5 or 6 weeks since we announced, this whole process has been, first of all, there's been, I think, huge amounts of support. We got over 600 people who were active volunteers. We got all these different committees, setting up the whole groundwork to run a really serious campaign. And it's also got me back to looking at issues that I, have written about over the past 25 years and obviously I care about, but I've kind of like left aside. So, we're challenging capitalism. We are talking about land back and decolonization. We are talking about degrowth. We are talking about economic democracy. We are talking about system change and a much, a very expansive kind of shift in politics again, I have written about, I've thought about over the years, but I've kind of left aside. But now in this context of, running to be the leader of the party, I've kind of got back to. So in a weird sort of way, running for the leadership of the NDP has actually sort of radicalized me in the short term sense, in that, I'm talking about issues that haven't really been talked about, that obviously there should be on the agenda, that are not on the agenda, like the fact that capitalism is, waging a war against working class, against human psyche, and against our capacity to sustain ourselves on this earth, and war against the environment. So it's been a kind of an interesting process of, weirdly enough, by going into formal politics, like I said, sort of radicalizing my thinking and my writing, and
Do you think they'll let you run for leadership?
I think they should let me. I mean, if discussing capitalism is not allowed to be part of an NDP leadership race, where we're supposed to have that conversation, right? They always tell you that elections is not the time. Elections is about winning votes, and let's stick to our talking points and this kind of stuff. They've already created the rules to basically exclude a more broad leadership debate and race, right? They massively increased the amount of money that has to be raised to participate in the race.
They went from 30,000 last time to 100,000 to have an entry fee.
Yeah, and the previous one was 15,000. So
the previous one was 15,000.
Yeah, I believe in 2012. And so they've really increased that. There's all these criteria for nominations, signatures, nominations. It's not just 100,000. They also take 25% of everything that's raised beyond the 100,000. So the candidate, you have obviously need some money to run your campaign. So it's not just 100,000, it's 100,000 plus the ability to, even to raise the 100,000, you need money to be able to raise that kind of money, right? And so they take 25% of that. There's vetting fee of 1,500. I mean, they're doing it in part, to be fair to the NDP, they're doing it partly because the party is kind of in quite a financial crisis. But they're also doing it, I think, for political reasons to constrain the debate. Now, but we've stated that we're going to do that. We're going to raise the money. We'll get it. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy at all. But we'll do that. But now, so if they blocked me, they would be foregoing a lot of money, that direct money, plus any people who would sign up to become members. It's all other money. Also, quite frankly, I think they would be foregoing other money because the more dynamic the race is, presumably all the candidates will be raising greater means. In my case specifically, if I am part of the race, I think that's very clear that we know that there are political forces in this country that are going to, let's just say, maybe they wouldn't have been part of the NDP race, but they are going to finance and support other candidates as a way to defeat my candidacy. So I think that the NDP, by blocking me, would actually be, dropping probably into certainly $150,000, but maybe a couple hundred thousand dollars, depending how you exactly assess that.
So you think that if you do start running, there's going to be just a campaign trying to stop you from winning?
Well, the campaign's already started. I mean, there's all these genocide advocates that have called on the NDP to block me. They sometimes run back and forth. At one hand, like the mayor of Hampstead, Jeremy Levy, he's like, when he announces, he tweets, "Oh, this is great that Yves running. It's going to destroy the NDP. This is the greatest thing." And the next day, he's tweeting about how I should be blocked. The NDP should block me. And then again, the next day, he's tweeting out Mayor Weinstein, the former head of the Jewish Defense League, saying that if you don't block Yves, it's the Nazi Party of Canada and stuff like that. So they're all over in terms of how they're going at this, but there's a whole bunch of advocates of killing every Palestinian in Gaza that are lobbying the NDP, and there's conservative MPs that are lobbying NDP to not allow me to run. And B'nai B'rith came out with this whole hit job that's based upon not about Palestine and not the standard smear of you're an anti-Semite, but in fact going at my writing on Rwanda. And so, which is interesting, they choose that rather than the Palestine or the anti-Semitism smear. It's kind of a backdoor admission that those kind of attacks don't work as well on the. And so they picked up on this article I wrote on Rwanda, and they put out a whole statement, and they claimed I'm a Rwandan genocide denier. There was a whole thing with, I can't prove this 100%, but almost certainly Israel bots did this whole thing, and they got X to get a community note on a post, basically again suggesting that I'm a Rwanda genocide denier, and so even the Israeli consul here in Montreal, he just posted about my participation in the leadership race, which we talk about foreign interference, and here you have the consul openly talking about my participation in the NDP leadership race, but that's not framed as threatening foreign interference. But so yes, there's no doubt if the NDP doesn't block me from running, that there is going to be a full-fledged campaign. I would expect they would probably draw in. I've already seen some signs of this. It would draw in NDP leaders in Manitoba and BC. There would be media. There would be genocide advocacy groups that would go to those, or Nenshi in Alberta, and demand they, condemn my candidacy and stuff like that. I would assume it will be a smear campaign like we may have not seen.
Based on the mood of leftists right now, do you think that might bolster your bid?
I think that the only way the NDP won't stop me, the main way the NDP won't stop me, is the more the Israel lobby attacks me. That is, amidst the Holocaust in Gaza, to be perceived as having caved to the forces of genocide is not popular with NDP members and not popular with the broad left. And so I think that let's call it the more intelligent elements of the genocide lobby, have stayed out of direct attacks against me because they understand that won't, in the, getting past the vetting, in fact, that bolsters me. And that's also why B'nai B'rith didn't do the attack on Palestine, but did the attack on what is, for most people, quite obscure, which is what happened in Rwanda in 1994, right. And then what's happened in the Congo over the past 30 years. We get into a whole discussion there, but so that's why they go that way. So yes, I think the more let's call it emotional proponents of Israel's crimes are engaging in attacks against me. They can't hold themselves back. They're not actually thinking strategically. They're thinking from the lens that the Zionist forces mostly have been operating on, which is just try to smash anything that stands up for Palestine and try to demonize, smear, fire, arrest, et cetera. And it's not strategic thinking that is that's motivating.
Something I wanted to ask you about is, so NDP's official stance on Palestine, I think at this point, is that it's a genocide. And it was interesting. I wrote an article, I don't know if you saw the article during the election, about how the vetting process for NDP candidates all over the country, they were actually silencing people and asking them to remove photos of them supporting Palestine, of them being at protest, etc. And then immediately, a week or two later, after I wrote that article, the NDP was very mad at me. They are still very mad at me, many of them. That's fine. That's how it works being a journalist. Jagmeet Singh goes on stage and calls it a genocide. So what is with this back and forth with the NDP on genocide? Because you see people like Alexandre Bourges who are just very openly calling it a genocide. And then you have these problems around this weird lobby in the NDP group that is Zionist in nature.
Well, there'd be lots to say on this. Let's just, what the targeting of candidates in this most recent round of elections was not as extreme as previous election rounds, right? I mean, they went to the point of blocking Paul Manley from running, Paul Manley being the son of Jim Manley, who was an NDP MP for 9 years in Nanaimo, and they blocked him from being able to run, and then he won the seat for the Greens. I mean, it was a total disaster from the NDP's perspective, and there's many other examples that are similarly egregious over many years. The NDP, and I've written about this in a number of places, in the 70s, it was more Zionistic than the conservatives and the liberals. There's a whole history, there's a Tommy Douglas quote that I've quoted many times about when he goes to Israel, and he says something, the only thing, this is in 1975, the only thing the only reason to be critical of Israel is because of how well it treats its workers. I mean, there's a whole, this is 8 years into the occupation, this is 30 years into the Nakba. So there's a long history. It has there's some ebbs and flows within that history, depending on who's in different positions and stuff like that. But if you go like Jagmeet Singh, right? That battle at the 2021 convention where we got the Palestine resolution through. And part of the reason we got that through was because one of the most embarrassing interviews I've ever come across on this subject, where Singh is asked about these resolutions to the NDP convention and about Palestine, and it won against the IHRA, the anti-Palestinian definition of anti-Semitism. And he goes so far down that path that it elicits this huge reaction, and Singh gets put on the back foot. And that's part of why they weren't able to block the resolutions, the Palestine resolution at the 2021 convention. They blocked in 2018. Singh actually mobilizes all kinds of supporters, family members to block it from even being discussed, the resolution in the committee phase. So, and this goes back, there's many other examples going back many, many years. So there's been a battle within the NDP on this issue. This has been the top battle at conventions in recent years and decades. And every little bit that has been, the advances are not just because, they see the light that it's wrong. It's because of grassroots activism inside and outside of the party pushing the ball forward. And so basically you got a situation where there's been this popular uprising over the past 22 months. Never before in the history of Canadian foreign policy, never before has there been more activism against Canada's complicity in international crimes as there have been in the past 22 months on Gaza. And that basically pushes the ship towards realizing that it's, quite frankly, in the party's, the overwhelming benefit of the party to start criticizing the genocide and crimes. And I wrote about it when Singh, referred to a genocide, and he did it both in the English and the French debate, and he should be applauded for that. And that's a big step forward. But if you look at all the context around that, all of the ways in which Singh cowered to the genocide lobby, this is a many, many year process, and there's many different elements to it. I've written many articles about the NDP's role on this stuff. So yeah, there's still those within the party that their orientation is to be concerned with what is the dominant media going to say about us? What is, are we going to be attacked or smeared as anti-Semitic? That is still an important consideration, less than it was 3 months ago, less than it was 6 months ago, less than it was 2 years ago, but that still is too much part of the equation rather than what is right. And, so that there's that battle continues to go on in the NDP, and already I think that my candidacy here is pushing the other candidates to be firmer and clearer in their condemnation. They're still being, I think, quite too restricted in their challenge to Canadian complicity. Like I put out a 10-point, is a leaflet that is part of this Palestine strategy, leafleting Palestine events across the country. There's an online version and a printed version. There's 10 points on the online version, 7 or 8 maybe on the printed version. And it raises things like Operation Proteus, Canada's training of the Palestinian Authority force that's overseeing the occupation of West Bank, getting rid of that. It talks about the special envoy, right? The supposedly anti-Semitism envoy that's just a tool to justify Israel's crimes. It talks about the terrorism list, right? The NDP won't touch that question. This is an anti-Palestinian terrorism list, and there's good civil liberties organizations have been calling for the terrorism list to be abolished for a long time. And from a Palestinian perspective, it definitely needs to be abolished. It talks about the Canadians fighting in the Israeli military, and that they violate the War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity Act. The NDP doesn't want to talk about that. McPherson, partly because they know that how the Israel lobby will spin that, you're targeting Canadian Jews. It talks about the Foreign Enlistment Act, Canadian institutions inducing Canadians to join the Israeli military. Again, there's been total reluctance to deal with that. The question of the registered charities, probably the most important Canadian contribution to Palestinian dispossession, is these 300 or so registered charities raising $500 million a year, subsidized by all Canadian taxpayers, that are assisting projects in Israel. This shouldn't exist. Israel is a GDP per capita is equivalent to Canada's. And not only should it not exist, at a macro level, there's a whole bunch of them supporting the Israeli military, West Bank settlements, and racist organizations in contravention of existing Canada Revenue Agency rules. So we're putting forward a much more maximalist demand. That while saying the maximalist is really important also, this is a point for the broader Palestine solidarity movement. It's actually really just about ending the unique support for Israel. It's about ending, a lot of this is just illegal. Canada's arms shipments, Foreign Enlistment Act, Canadians fighting in Gaza, the registered charities, a lot of that contravenes existing Canadian law. So to a large extent, we're actually just calling for upholding existing Canadian law. But our support for Israel is so extreme and unique that is outside of the official bounds calling that. So we're not calling for like, a BDS towards Israel. That's a whole another step past just ending this unique support. And we can have that discussion. And obviously there's many, good people doing all kinds of good activism on that stuff. But the demands are really just about ending this unique support. And the NDP is not willing to take that on. And as you point out, there's still forces within the party. They're much, much weaker than they were months ago or years ago that are into the headspace of let's repress people who are fighting against the Holocaust. I mean, that's just, remarkable that people would want to take down images of them fighting against this crime of all crimes taking place in Gaza. But there are people in the NDP that, want to see that happen.
Yeah. Absolutely. Do you think the left can actually win in Canada, considering we're a big tent sort of country? We don't have a strong enough system currently to support a diversity of parties because we're on the first past the post system or single member constituency system. Do you think it's possible that a firm leftist who isn't appealing to that big tent, do you think they can win in Canada?
I don't think it's going to be, it won't be easy. That's for sure. But I do think there is a lot of angst and anger at the state of affairs. I mean, I think if you look at the
pretty obviously, I think.
Yeah. The billionaires and the tens of billionaires, the ecological, on Palestine, I mean, more than half the population thinks it's a genocide. It's, 2 or 3 to 1 who want to, end lessen Canadian support for Israel and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot of anger and quite frankly, confusion. I think a lot of people don't understand, like the housing question. We're in a serious housing emergency. I mean, the level of unhoused people in the major cities, and not just the major cities now, is just, it's stunning. And that right populists like Poilievre have been able to tap into all kinds of angst around housing. But to a large extent, it's not simply this, but overwhelmingly, this is just simple public policy of cutting back of funding for public housing and co-ops. And then also this financialization of rental and housing, where you just basically turn it into a place of corporate profit. And it's subsidized. It's enabled and subsidized by the tax code to have these companies take over rental housing, jack up rents, and then they don't have to pay a corporate tax. I mean, it's remarkable. And obviously Poilievre's not going to deal with the issue in a way that's what's needed. The Liberals have shown over a decade they're not up to doing this. And so there's a need for a left, socialistic, anti-capitalist vision of housing. I think that can resonate, right? Will it be easy? Will the media smear endlessly? For sure. But I think on some of the fundamentals, there's actually a lot more support for what are my values than what are the values of Pierre Poilievre or Mark Carney.
Are we sure about that? Because in this last election, I mean, the NDP got trounced.
Well, the last election, people wanted to stand up to Donald Trump. I mean, does Mark Carney want to stand up to Donald Trump? Mark Carney
doesn't seem like it.
He's conceded endlessly, and the polls still show.
And the polls are still saying he's super popular, though. So what's going on with that? Why do you think that is?
But I mean, I think that's mostly tied to how the dominant media frames things. Polling of people's attitudes. This is not just today or 6 months ago, a year ago. Certainly on economic issues, on social programs, on inequality. Polling consistently shows that people don't like the billionaires. They don't like the Westons and the oligopolistic food retail practices. They support healthcare. They want greater investment in education and stuff like that. The polls show that. This is not new. This goes back decades and decades. And what the Liberals generally do is they run to the left in elections and then they govern to the right. Carney, the main way he did that in the last election was he acted like he was going to get tough on Trump, and that resonated with people. As I've written about, he's all elbows up. and now he won't even skate into the corner to get the puck. And so it's people's the filter of the dominant media is still a very powerful in terms of how shaping people's attitudes about politicians, about political parties. When it comes again to some of the core kind of issues, I think there's a lot of sympathy, and just because there's a lot of sympathy doesn't mean you can win. But there are ways, if you're creative, if you're well organized, if you're committed, that you can have impacts. I should just say this on this. One of the things with NDP and its history, of writing something about this, is that the greatest victory of the NDP, what the NDP is sort of best known for, Tommy Douglas bringing in Medicare, they lost the next election. That was in the fourth election in Saskatchewan that they introduced that. It led to a doctor's strike, which was, just, my father wrote a book. He grew up in Moose Jaws. He wrote a book about growing up during the doctor's strike and being a newspaper boy, or, bringing the newspaper around. And so he went back and he looked at all the coverage in the Moose Jaw where he grew up, in the Moose Jaw Times Herald. And it's stunning, right? This is like, democracy is dead, freedom is ended because of bringing in Medicare. That was the reaction of the dominant media. And unfortunately for the party, it didn't hurt them at the election. They lose the next election. They're out of office for 8 or 9 years after that. So you can win and lose, right? You can win. Everyone would now say, obviously, it was worth losing an election to bring in Medicare and the impact, and even for the party in a long-term sense and all that. So I think that some of what I'm trying to do has to be seen in that kind of framework. If you mobilize social movements, you get activism going, you might not be as electoralist as another alternative, but you might have more impact on the direction of the country in a positive way than a more electoralist. Now, and the problem for the current NDP brass and the dominant ethos is that they've basically driven the party into the ground by following this, how do we be most amenable to the corporate media? I mean, 7 seats, 7 MPs is a pretty disastrous result. And that's by following the let's not be bold, let's kind of make sure that the Globe Mail's not unhappy with us kind of direction. And so their arguments on that front are pretty tenuous.
But the Liberal Party under Justin Trudeau got some of the bigger leftist wins in Canadian history. Now, the bar might be low, but it did. And so is the NDP losing because they got a lot of things out of the Trudeau government? Childcare, we're talking about dental care, we're talking about pharmacare. Are they suffering because they were willing to trade off on that? Or is it because they have poor messaging?
I think there is some of that. I think Poilievre was actually successful in framing the NDP in that way, and sort of some of the negative sentiment that built up towards Trudeau spilled over to the NDP, and I think that Singh's, those a lot. The agreement with the Liberals there's differing ways of looking at that. I think from politically, but I also think that there was lots of space to be much bolder in their positioning. I mean, the clearest one to me is on the Palestine question, where there was activism. There is activism. All this activism, mostly younger, mostly people of color, and they were basically non-existent in supporting that. In fact, more often than not, they were criticizing those protests. They were saying, that infamous one where it went past Mount Sinai Hospital and Spider-Man for Palestine waved a flag, and then the Zionist lobby said they were waving a flag at a historically Jewish hospital, and they did this whole, and Jagmeet Singh came out and condemned the protest. I mean, it's so ludicrous that it's hard to even believe it happened. And so rather than trying to become part of that movement, part of the wave of activism, they tried to very clearly distance himself from it. There's obviously the Sarah Jama things, all kinds of different dimensions of some federal, some provincial, whatever. But so I think that there was definitely room, even if you were going to continue with the agreement with the Liberals, there was room to be more bold and more justice and activist minded within that kind of that
framework.
dynamic.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Listen, Eves, I've already kept you 22 minutes beyond where we agreed, so I'm going to let you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today on the trail. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we head off?
Nope. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you guys for tuning into On the Trail once again, and I hope you come back for the next time. You can check out yvesengler.com. That's YVESENGLER.com if you want to see his works, buy his books, and you can check out my work at isaacpeltz.ca. You can sign up for the newsletter, and you can, of course, go check out my work on social media. Have a nice life.